Welcome to this installment of the Commonwealth of Learning's Open Education Week interview series. I'm Jako Olivier, Advisor Higher Education from the Commonwealth of Learning. Joining me today is Dr. Rajiv Jhangiani, who is the Vice Provost Teaching and Learning at Brock University in Ontario, Canada. Here he also directs the Inclusive Education Research Lab. He's also the architect of Canada's first zero textbook cost degree programs. His scholarship focuses on open educational practices, student-centered pedagogies, and ethical approaches to educational technology. Welcome. How do you see open educational practices in the wider Commonwealth context, where institutions and especially students may have limited access to resources and the internet?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I really appreciate the question, and I suppose I would broaden the context just a little bit. I would argue that you can't necessarily count on universal access to reliable high-speed internet access, even in a relatively privileged North American educational context as well. And I would argue that with a growing proportion of Indigenous learners, first-generation students, Black, Indigenous, and other broader people of color among faculty, students, and staff as well, we have a greater obligation to attend to students who are at the margins, who are underrepresented in higher education, to ensure that we're not replicating privilege. But to address your question more directly, I would say, as we all know, OER can be offline. OER can be in print format. OER is certainly enabled by and catalyzed further by digital possibilities. But you can still engage in, for example, the revision and remixing of open educational resources, including in partnership with students, without the benefit of reliable high-speed internet. I would also submit that beyond working with open educational resources, if you engage in open pedagogical practices, that does not always have to take the form of public scholarship either. In many cases, you're working with students within the walled garden of the learning management system, so you could be engaging in networked learning even without internet access. It's ultimately, I would say, about the democratization of access and of learning. So if you are still co-creating learning policies, learning activities, learning assessments with students, you can do this in ways that amplify their work with digital capabilities, enable wider reuse as well. And you can still do that perhaps periodically. But I think what matters much more is the attention to access, is the attention to equity, and the invitation for students to exercise more agency in their learning. And those are all themes, I think, that are not entirely dependent on access to particular resources or indeed the internet.
Thank you very much. You touched on the students' role in the process. Uh, Thinking of Commonwealth higher education institutions, how would you make that practical? So, how can we actually embrace these open educational practices, um, you know, in the higher education context?
But I think part of it starts with the positioning of the instructor. What are they attempting to achieve in the classroom? In an age of information abundance, but perhaps also abundance of misinformation and these days disinformation, the role of the educator becomes even more critical beyond pure information delivery. So thinking about ways in which we can perhaps decenter our role in the classroom as educators, invite students to draw on their substantial experience and help curate that learning experience. I mean, in practical terms, I would say there was a time where I might have developed course policies by myself and imposed them on students and expected them to follow it. But along the way, as an open educator, I think you realize that if you co-create course policies or schedules of work or alternative assignments with students, you don't have to police student work if it is co-created by them. It is their learning environment that you've co-created. And so beyond the question of compliance, you're now inviting much more creativity, much more engagement as well in a journey that's much more personal. So I think that's part of the core question that educators need to think about when we're talking about open, right? Because of course you could use technically what is an open textbook, but treat it much the same as a commercial textbook. So it's not really about the resource. It's about your approach to teaching and learning. Are you comfortable with students exercising much more agency in the learning environment? And of course, if you are, you're going to begin to see the many great advantages of when they don't just complete their work, but they go well above and beyond, because now it's a source of pride and an outlet for creativity as well. So I think for me, the first question is, what is the role of the educator in the classroom? How does this dance, this choreography work with students who are bringing substantial life experience into the classroom as well?
Just a follow-up question. You touched on a very interesting concept there, bringing in the student voice in the policy development. I don't think necessarily that is always associated with open educational practices that seems tend to be focused on the classroom. How do you find university managements and students embracing that participation in the policy development process?
Quite well, to be honest. I mean, of course, this is not appropriate in all places or in all ways, but I think it's always possible to find some elements of policy where students can exercise some agency, where you can account for differences among students who, for example, have parental responsibilities, who are adult learners, who are not just coming out of the traditional high school age demographic as well. I think students really respond positively when they are treated with respect and given that control over their learning journey. But to give you a practical example, my colleagues and I in our Inclusive Education Research Lab just concluded a study in which we operationalized many of the elements of open pedagogy into a course syllabus, so almost a brochure, if you will, for a hypothetical course. Now, this was just an outline, a written document, but it laid out, for example, a philosophy, particular sets of policies, particular kinds of assignments where students were given the option to engage in public scholarship, or indeed the use of open educational resources as well. And we were quite amazed to see that even at this level, and it's not close to the intervention of a compassionate, caring, embodied educator, but even written content that reflects this philosophy of teaching led students to say, I'm more likely to register in this course, to choose this learning experience, and evaluated this hypothetical instructor in much more positive terms. So I think it starts to outline that there are practical ways in which you can implement a philosophy of open education in a classroom, even if it's in a physical space or it's in a digital space. But the core values that are shining through are I care about access, I care about equity, and I care about your agency as learners. And I think you can take a step back and consider the many ways in which you can infuse those values into your teaching practice, whether or not you're dealing with digital materials or the internet. And I would say, just as another small example, as we talk about open pedagogy, whether it's editing Wikipedia, whether it is authoring exam questions instead of solely writing exam answers, um, in respect of student agency, it is their intellectual property. So having conversations with students along the way around their intellectual property rights, whether they wish to openly license their IP or not, and which open license they would like to choose, that's another wonderful opportunity on the path to this kind of outcome, is engaging in that kind of digital literacy and building students' capacity as well to engage in open practices. So that's another piece I would just add, which is when you're embracing open pedagogy, when you're working with students, um, you can you can you can do so in a way that tramples over student rights. And I think it is important again to not just do work in the open, but to do it in concert with open values, which in this case involves not just informed consent, but active agency.
Thank you very much. The idea of open educational practices have been around for a while, and I think you've touched a little bit on some of the innovative practices that are there. But what do you think is new in terms of open educational practices? And if you can guess, what will be next?
Certainly. Well, uh, my caveat over here is I'm going to set aside entirely the unbridled excitement with which I think neoliberals are seeking to exploit artificial intelligence in the worst possible ways in education. I'm not going to address that. But I will say I've been most happy to see the emergence of a much more explicit and, in fact, a multi-dimensional connection of social justice to open educational practices. It's always been a part of the philosophy, and there's lots of scholars from Cheryl Hodgkinson Williams to Sarah Lambert and others, Henry Trotter, who've laid out that connection. But in recent years, I've seen this be much more explicit. So when we're talking about, for example, advancing redistributive justice, reallocating resources to those who by circumstance have less. If we're talking about recognitive justice in the form of, let's say, sociocultural diversity of the curriculum, which means you're not just using open educational resources and displacing costs for students. You're now taking advantage of, for example, the permissions to revise and remix open content to actually localize and diversify the content. And then you go further with representational justice, where you're thinking about political voice. You're thinking actively about the epistemologies that are permitted to enter academic journals. You're thinking about the academic gatekeeping as well, indigenous ways of being, knowing, and doing as well, just as one illustration. So for me, I think that's been a wonderful shift to see this explicit focus on social justice and its various dimensions. But beyond social justice and perhaps connected to it is really much more attention to criticality. So there's I think an acknowledgement that you could design an immensely effective and even engaging learning environment and still perpetrate harm. And you could do that by, for example, ignoring accessibility. You can do it by not providing students with agency. You can trample over students' intellectual property rights, as I said. You could ignore labor issues, which are rife in open education, right from precarious faculty, perhaps contingent faculty members who are on short-term contracts, who are themselves not being provided with enough support, to things like the invisible labor of librarians that are often lying behind the discoverability and integration of open educational resources into courses. So overall, I would say these are the big themes for me that are incredibly important, is the attention to social justice, and of course, a greater embrace of criticality. And I will say, I don't think this is an accident. I think as the conversations around open education have broadened beyond sort of a narrower North American privileged context, as more voices have been amplified, because they've always existed. But whether it's from colleagues in South Africa, from India, from the Open University of Sri Lanka, and other places where people are doing leading work, I think there's a lot to learn from those contexts. And so we want to make sure that we're not doing harm with the very best of intentions. And I think that's been the crux of the conversation at most of the meetings and conferences of open education that I've been able to attend over the last few years.
Well, yeah, thank you very much. I think that it's very enlightening to see that these are the emerging issues, and I hope that it will also reflect elsewhere in education. But I think for open education, there's a lot of room for this to grow and be extended in institutions.
Mhm.
Dr. Rajiv, thank you very much for your wonderful inputs today. It was good to hear how you see open educational practices. From my side, from Commonwealth of Learning, thank you once again. And yes, all the best with your work in the open education sphere.
Thank you very much. This was a privilege.